Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find the show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can, of course, follow through RSS feed and also email updates. I'm, of course, on YouTube. You can find me on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, and Player FM. Later on Friday nights, I am, of course, rebroadcast on a host of other networks, including Awake, People's Internet Radio, Ed Opperman's Spreaker channel. And on Saturdays from 6 to 8 Mountain Time, you can hear me replayed on KYAH 540 AM out in Utah. If you want to support my work, you can, of course, go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond, and you can become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month, which, of course, gets you access to the exclusive bonus podcast. But I think that's enough of me because I am very excited about our guest for this week, and we have a lot to discuss, so I don't want to blather on too much at the beginning. But we are joined on the line by Judi Rever, who is a freelance journalist and is someone who I have admired for quite some time now, and I think faithful listeners will be somewhat familiar with Judi's work because I tweet about it and I've talked about it on the show. But Judi started her career with Radio France International and then later worked for AFP, reporting from Africa and the Middle East. Her work has been featured in numerous publications, including the Globe and Mail in Canada, Foreign Policy Journal, Digital Journal, and the Africa Report, among several other publications. And Judi has just written a fantastic new book, which I was fortunate enough to get a review copy of. And the book is In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. So we are going to be talking about the RPF, Paul Kagame, Rwanda, Congo, the whole sort of Great Lakes region, and much more. But Judi Rever, how are you? It's good to finally be talking to you.
Hi, Pierce. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great. And Judi, why don't we, before we kind of dive into this, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, and then what kind of led you to investigating the RPF and Paul Kagame, and essentially what is still, to a large degree, kind of the untold story of the 1994 genocide, and then, of course, what ultimately followed with the First and later Second Congo War. But tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Well, I'm from Montreal, and I first got interested in Africa intensely after I went to Congo. Congo had just been through a major crisis. It was after the president called Mobutu Sese Seko had been toppled by Kagame and his army. That was in 1997. So I was a young journalist. I went there to cover the humanitarian crisis. I knew some of what had gone on, but not fully. I didn't fully understand the extent of it. And within a few days of my arrival, I was in the Congolese jungle with some local humanitarian workers who were Congolese. And what we were doing essentially was we were on search and rescue missions to find and assist Rwandan Hutu refugees who had been chased by Kagame's army and who had lost many family members in the jungle. Now, the back story to that is after the Rwandan Genocide occurred in 1994, Kagame set up shop. He had seized power. He was victorious. He comes from the Tutsi minority, and hundreds of thousands, actually a few million Rwandan Hutus had fled to neighboring countries. The biggest population of Rwandan Hutu refugees was in Zaire, which later became Congo. That was in 94. So in 96, Kagame wanted to bust up those camps, control the refugees, and he ended up with his army having even more sinister aims. What they did was push many of the refugees further into Zaire, and he killed them. And in the process, they toppled Mobutu as well, and there was a whole new restructuring in Central Africa. So I started it was a baptism by fire. That's how I got to understand what Kagame and his army was like. And that's when I saw firsthand the level of carnage.
And we should, I guess we should also note that the genocide in Rwanda, which took place over 100-day period, it started on April 7th and lasted till about mid-July 1994. So it is I believe it's the 24th anniversary of the start of the genocide right now. And we're going to get into the specifics of that. And again, I think some of the listeners might be a little familiar with it. We've talked about it before on the show, but it's been quite a while. So we'll probably have to do a little bit of background information on all of that. But Judi, you write in the beginning of your book, sort of starts in Congo in the mid to late 90s, and you begin to kind of hear stories, and you start meeting with Hutu refugees who begin to kind of tell you something that, for the most part, the mainstream media and others were really not reporting on at all. And you talk quite a bit about this sort of shock about learning about the RPF's crimes. And just give the listeners sort of an idea of what it was like at that time, when essentially all we heard was that Paul Kagame was this hero, that he was part of this like new generation of African leaders. He was beloved by, Bill Clinton in the West in particular. And talk a little bit about the sort of shock again at beginning to sort of see what the RPF was in reality, which was quite different from the portrait that the media had put out there.
Well, I think you've described some of that well. What I saw firsthand in May and June 1997 in the sort of the northern Zaire, northern Congo, is when we went into the jungle, and then when I visited other transit camps south of Kisangani and around Kisangani, and then further west in Bandaka, I saw what the Rwandan Patriotic Front and its army, that's Kagame's army, had done to Hutu refugees. And so when I say what they had done, they had slaughtered people. I had done extensive interviews with survivors in the jungle and in camps throughout the country who were in, a few of them were on the verge, it looked, of death. The children were suffering from diseases. They told me that their parents had been slaughtered. Some of the adults who'd survived, a few of them had bullet wounds that had infected. They told me specifically that Kenya Rwanda speaking troops, Kenya Rwanda is the language of Rwandans, had surrounded camps, had chased them across the country, surrounded camps, localized them, and unleashed gunfire on their camps. And they kept moving essentially from the eastern part of Congo, and those who survived kept moving west. And every time they would set up a camp and try to establish themselves and feed themselves, then Kagame's Tutsi troops would come in and find them and start shooting. or worse. And sometimes there would be smaller units that would force the Hutus to bury their loved ones at gunpoint. So, I mean, I did all these incredible interviews that were heartbreaking, quite frankly. But during those interviews, what also emerged was because I kept asking, why did you stay in Zaire? Why did you flee to Zaire in the first place after the genocide? Why did you stay here? And why did you become targets? Why didn't you just go home? The war was over. Kagame had stopped the genocide. And, I still framed what I had seen as horrific as it was. I framed it somehow because I had absorbed a lot of the propaganda. I framed those killings as reprisal killings at first. I was quite overwhelmed seeing these people and hearing their accounts. And they told me we fled because they told me they had fled Rwanda initially in 1994, and they had stayed in the camps and they refused to go home because Kagame's troops were killing their families in 1994. And they also had very credible reports, constant reports, that those who had left the camps in Zaire and gone home had disappeared. So this was very troubling to me, and I was trying to take it in and at the same time and understand it at the same time, completely do an investigation of what had happened in Congo. So I listened, I was confused, I was intrigued, and I kept doing these interviews. And after my whole experience in Congo, I went to Rwanda to finalize my reporting and see and interview some Hutu refugees who had been quite frankly forcefully returned back to Rwanda aboard sometimes trucks, but also mostly planes by the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And so I went to transit camps in Rwanda, and I saw the level of fear of some of the Rwandan Hutus at those transit camps. And one man in particular who was in very bad shape told me he had lost his family in eastern Zaire. They were close to them. His little girl and his wife had been shot by Rwandan troops. And he told me that some of our conversation was on tape, some of it wasn't, because he asked me to shut off my recorder, and he was very upset and so was I, that there were all these Rwandan Tutsi soldiers around the camp stationed and listening to people. He told me that he lost his family, his first family in Rwanda during the genocide. And I remember saying, did Interahamwe, the Hutu militia, kill your family? Because I had known and I had read and heard, like everyone else, that Hutus also killed Hutus. And the word was Hutu extremists and Hutu militia had killed Hutu opponents, people who resisted the genocide against the Tutsis in 1994. And he said, no, my family was not killed by Hutu militia. And I said, were you an opponent of Habyarimana's regime? Habyarimana was the president who was assassinated, and who Hutu hardliners, I understood, wanted to kill. He said, no, I was not an opponent. I was simply a teacher who worked in Rwanda. And he kept looking at me, and he kept insisting. He said, I see that you really want to understand my story. And, he was shaking and I was shaking. And he led me to believe that, it wasn't any Hutu opponent or Hutu militia that killed his first family. And all this wave of it was like an epiphany, or that moment of that shock of recognition. And I couldn't breathe. And everything that I had heard in Congo was being confirmed in more detail, but in a troubling, unspoken way as well, because the camp was surrounded by this man who was in such poor shape, and he was all alone, and yet he had this ability, or he really wanted to tell me about his life and what he had suffered. So I left Rwanda and went back to Europe, where I was living, and tried to assemble my reporting and my reports on this. But I was so terribly shaken, and I listened to my tapes in the weeks after, and I said, my God, there's so much more to this story than I understood, than I still understand. I have to keep digging, because what I have seen and what I have heard is diametrically opposed to the stories in mainstream journalism that we've heard, that Kagame is a leader of what will become an African renaissance in Central Africa. Kagame was the moral victor in a struggle of good against evil that overwhelmed Rwanda in 1994, that Tutsis were the sole victims of that genocide, and that Hutus were the perpetrator. So I really struggled with this, but I knew something was terribly wrong, and I had to understand what had really happened.
Mm. No, and once again, your book, In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, is an amazing book sort of exploring all these topics. And again, it's amazing too in the sense that, there aren't really that many books still out there. I mean, there are some books that were written by Rwandans that are in French, that are now out of print. And there are certainly some journalists that have been talking about this, but your book is a wonderful sort of, I think, sort of like entree into this whole world. And again, you very concisely kind of lay out the entire story. We should mention the book is available right now on Amazon. That's right, Judi?
Yes, it is. And within a few days, I think I'll be able to announce on Twitter that the ebook, the digital version of my book, is going to be available in the United States and throughout Europe and in Africa, everywhere except for the UK, because there's still issues with the UK. But so that means for about $15 or so, your readers will be able to download Kindle or ebook or iBooks. And this is exciting for me, because I wrote the book to reach a wider audience. I don't want us to continue to stay in an echo chamber. I wanted people who are interested in world events and in international policy and geopolitics to be able to pick up this book and understand an important part of history. And so obviously I wanted people to be able to afford it.
Oh, no, and again, too, if you know nothing about the reality of the RPF and Paul Kagame and his regime and ultimately what unfolded in Rwanda, and also, let's not forget Congo. As brutal as the genocide in Rwanda was, what was later inflicted on Congo, which I think we'll get to a bit later, is, you really can't even quantify it. We're talking about millions of people being slaughtered, essentially for control of minerals and other natural resources. And your book is just a fantastic way to educate people about all that. So I highly encourage people to get a copy of it. Judi, I want to just dive a little bit deeper now into the conflict and flesh out some of the kind of key players and stuff, because I think people again are going to be somewhat unfamiliar with Paul Kagame, with the RPF and what was going on. So give us a little background on who Paul Kagame was, because he like much of the RPF and much of the sort of political and military elite that rules Rwanda, he did not really grow up in Rwanda. He was not part of what are called the interior Tutsis, who are people that stayed in Rwanda under the Hutu ruled government. And he actually grew up in Uganda and was later head of Ugandan intelligence. So explain a little bit about who Paul Kagame really is.
Well, as you say, Paul Kagame was not raised in Uganda. He was not raised in Rwanda. He certainly is Rwandan, but he is known as a Rwandan that is part of the Ugandan wing, so to speak. So during the late 50s and early 60s, there were a wave of Tutsis, Rwandan Tutsi families that fled to other countries around Rwanda. So many of them went to Uganda, some of them went to Burundi, some Congo, and some Tanzania. And there were others in the greater diaspora. So there were a series of pogroms after the establishment of the First Republic of Rwanda. So Rwanda transitioned from a Belgian Tutsi monarchy to a real country. And that country was an independent country that was ruled by the majority ethnic group, which was the Hutus. And so what we have is in Uganda, a group of people who were raised largely in refugee camps, and many of these people benefited from and were also used by the state of Uganda. So Paul Kagame and a number of his colleagues, senior members, they became rebels in Uganda, in the Ugandan rebellion. Yoweri Museveni's rebel army. Yoweri Museveni is the current president, a longtime president of Uganda.
32 years, I think.
Yeah. And he also overthrew, with the help of Kagame and a lot of Rwandan soldiers who became part of the Ugandan resistance, overthrew Idi Amin and Milton Obote, late 70s, mid 80s. But to be honest, there were a lot of Tutsis in Uganda who benefited from and were protected under the Idi Amin regime. So that's a bit of a sidebar, an interesting story. But when Yoweri Museveni and his Rwandan rebels, soldiers, overthrew Milton Obote in the 1980s, Paul Kagame then became, you mentioned this, the spy chief for the Ugandan army. And he was known for inflicting sadistic torture methods on enemies of the state. He became very effective, had a reputation for being very brutal. Also during that time, it should be pointed out that the Ugandans, and this is perhaps where the Rwandan RPF, RPA learned some of these tactics. They were known to be experts in staging false flags. So staging attacks that made it look like the enemy was attacking and wreaking havoc on the civilian population. So we see in the late 80s, Yoweri Museveni's army, with the help of the Rwandans, staging attacks in the north to some extent on the Akoli population, which was problematic for Yoweri Museveni's regime. So some of those war tactics and guerrilla war methods were learned in Uganda. And so by the time 1990 comes around, these guys that were part of a political movement now and still in the Ugandan army, they were the Rwandan Patriotic Front and their army, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, and they had certainly planned for a number of years the invasion of Rwanda. So in October 1990 of that year, we saw the beginning of what would be more than a 3-year, almost 4-year brutal invasion war into northern Rwanda that successfully managed to allow the Kagame's troops to seize a lot of land in the north and hold the Hutu regime hostage in a sense. And that's the whole background and context to the genocide.
Mm. And you're mentioning Kagame's reputation as being pretty brutal. You talk in the book that in Uganda Kagame is known as Pilato, which is a reference to Pontius Pilate. And Kagame was involved in the Ugandan Bush War, and really just some pretty nasty conflicts that he sort of cut his teeth in. Judi, quickly, because we'll probably be talking about it a bit more. What is the DMI? What is it? What is it? How does it function? And what's the role that it played before, during, and after the genocide? Because the DMI is extremely integral in orchestrating and carrying out Kagame's more sort of psychotic political goals.
DMI is the military wing of the Rwandan Patriotic Front and its army. So it's the intelligence wing, I should say, and it stands for the Directorate of Military Intelligence. And really, it's from from DMI and from this organ that all decisions are made, essentially, in Rwanda. They of course work with the RPF political bureau. They decide on policy, but the tactics of the Rwandan regime today, and even back then in the 1990s, and the way in which it executes crimes, all flows from DMI, the Directorate of Military Intelligence. So I didn't put this in my book, but as an analogy, it's really the brain of the central nervous system of Rwanda under Kagame today. And you may say, or I might say, that the RPF Secretariat and the political bureau is the spinal column. But if we're looking at Rwanda as the central nervous system, the RPF, certainly the brain is DMI, and everything flows from there. So what we have, I say in the book, is the mask of this idea of the mask of innocence that the RPF wears in front of the international community, how it gained power in Rwanda as so many people were dying at the cost of so much human life. The mask of the victims, because they play the mask of the victims. The Tutsis were victims of genocide, that is true, but how it uses that victimhood and how it continues to wage war. It's all in the structure. I try to lay out as best as I can the structure of the party, and that structure has at its heart the intelligent wings. Everything, all that is ruthless flows from there, and these enormously successful, I would say, plotting and strategic men have decided on this flow of criminality. So it starts with DMI.
Mm. Well, it's, you're just saying there to think of it as the nervous system, and in fact, the DMI was called the network at one point, and then later technicians, which is a very quite a euphemism for what they were doing. And yeah, as you said, I mean, they oversaw and directed the genocide. They were integral in actually carrying out the larger sort of plans that Kagame had. And yeah, I mean, you document this time and time again. I mean, if anyone has the book in front of them, you can go to page 67, where you lay out the some of the main areas that the DMI were trained in, which is using poison to poison water, chemicals to poison water, how to strangle people, how to gather intelligence. DMI was also very much about infiltrating the Interahamwe at one point, and we'll get to that a bit later, attacking the UN buffer zone. Again, as you said, the DMI is essentially, without them, they would not be able to sort of carry out what Kagame's ultimate plan was. And I guess on that note, let's talk a little bit about the kind of ideology of the RPF, and the rationale behind their actions. I mean, because again, the propaganda that we've heard time and time again from Kagame and from the West is as you said, the Tutsis were targeted, and I'm not doubting that at all. I mean, they were absolutely targeted. And we can get into a little bit later, I mean, how that really unfolded, because there is certainly evidence to suggest that the RPF not only targeted Tutsis, but also, infiltrated Hutu groups in order to incite violence against Tutsis. But let's kind of pull that back a little bit and kind of go a little bit deeper. Because when you get past that, what you really see is Kagame and this sort of small inner circle of RPF members who had a very sort of terrifying plan for what they were going to turn Rwanda into. And it's so interesting reading your book and learning about this. I mean, you see that they had almost like no real connection anymore with Rwanda. I mean, for instance, they relied very heavily on the sort of like civilian cadres that they had developed inside Rwanda, because many of them didn't really geographically know where places in Rwanda were. There's several mentions in the book when you hear RPF commanders speaking in Swahili, a language that is not common in Rwanda. Many Rwandans don't know Swahili. So, Judi, explain a little bit kind of about what was the RPF's ideology? What was their goal for Rwanda? Because it's quite different from the, we're just going to stop the genocide and become this wonderful, peace-loving nation where, they're always sort of hyping up, coffee exports and things like that. And Rwanda is it is a beautiful place, but, there's a much more sinister nature behind this. So explain a little bit about, what the RPF's ideology and their sort of plan for Rwanda was.
Well, my research and having spoken to so many of them and having understood what happened on the ground, and speaking to people, quite frankly, who I find quite evolved, who broke with the regime, and others who still, unfortunately, believe in some of that ideology. So I've interviewed so many people for hundreds and hundreds of hours everywhere. I think ultimately the ideology, for lack of a better way of putting it was to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, what they feel was rightfully theirs. So reclaim power. Essentially, their goal was to reclaim power, not share it with Hutus. It was to take it, seize it, and then benefit from it. So the way in which they did that was to establish support networks everywhere. So what they needed to do, they needed Tutsis in exile throughout, in Congo and Burundi, and to convince them that what we're going to do here is good for you. We will reclaim Rwanda as ours. We have a sense of entitlement. We were pushed out, and we will provide living space for you in after we seize power. And so, I mean, there's legitimacy, of course, in the right to return of all these Tutsi refugees, but the way in which it was done was unfair. And of course, the Tutsi refugees who had been pushed to Rwanda, Uganda, and other countries will tell you, and this is true, that the Hutus seized their families' assets in Rwanda during the pogroms, took their livelihoods away from them and their homes and the land that they had in various areas. And so what they did, during the invasion war to some extent, but mostly during the genocide and after, was reclaim that. So there's a tit for tat aspect to every part of contemporary Rwandan history that you look at. So I think that is the ideology that is most striking about the Rwandan Patriotic Front that I can share with listeners. If you want to go a bit deeper, let me know.
No. I mean, I completely agree with you there. I mean, that's this, like you said, this sense of entitlement, and just historically speaking, we should note that the Tutsis were, I guess, have always been a minority ethnic group within Rwanda, and under the brutal Belgian colonization, it was the Tutsi minority was elevated. There was this monarchy composed of Tutsi royals that ruled over the Hutu majority. So, again, this sort of tit for tat when the Hutus come into power. Naturally, many of them, seize land from Tutsis, but I mean, it almost becomes irrelevant when this sort of back and forth, because at some point then, you get to 1990, 1994, when hundreds of thousands of people are being murdered in this, tit for tat, you took my land, I'm going to take yours. Judi, explain a little bit some of the kind of like the economics of the war and the genocide, because, a lot of this was about exterminating Hutus and seizing land. And also maybe touch on a little bit, I mean, there was also sort of a hatred of some of the interior Tutsis as well. This is sort of, again, one of the myths of the RPF, that they're these defenders of human rights and stuff. I mean, they killed Tutsis as well as Hutu. I mean, it didn't really matter to them, right?
No, you're right. There was a concerted effort to kill Hutus by the RPF, even in the invasion war before the genocide, and certainly in earnest during the genocide. But you mentioned interior Tutsis, which I should have actually talked about earlier. It's a real difficult relationship with the Rwandans who grew up in Uganda and those who stayed. And just to get back to the level of infiltration, how the RPF used interior Tutsis in the run-up to the genocide is, and used cadres, for example, is there were several hundred what we call small cells in Rwanda, throughout Rwanda, in Kigali, but throughout the entire countries in the run-up to the genocide. And those cells could be one or two people in a house, or they could have been like in universities across Rwanda. They could be, in bars, because the Rwandan Patriotic Front had contacts, and they had basically established networks of Tutsi civilians in these cells, made up these cells throughout Rwanda before the genocide. So this network of contacts provided basic, crucial intelligence for the RPF in its invasion war, and which enabled as well the RPF to carry out a series of operations in the run-up to the assassination of the president, and then as soon as the genocide was unleashed. So all this to say is they had infiltrated the country, and they used this network of Tutsi, interior Tutsis. And to be honest, some of these interior Tutsis were idealists and people who felt that the RPF would perhaps, overthrow Habyarimana, but bring forth democracy, open up political space, ensure greater security for interior Tutsis. But that's not what happened, of course. And so interior Tutsis were the first in line to be targeted as soon as the genocide started to unfold. And the RPF had certainly planned effectively in the sense that they knew that the Tutsis would be targeted by hardline elements among Hutu political parties and in the Hutu militia. And so in egging on, in infiltrating, the RPF infiltrated those Hutu militias and Hutu youth wings, and in egging on the violence during the genocide, they sacrificed more of those interior Tutsis, who they had actually a lot of contempt for to begin with. A lot of Tutsi former RPF soldiers and officers have admitted to me. So we also saw, and you mentioned this very briefly, we saw during the genocide the RPF technicians, those commandos, they had infiltrated the Hutu militias. This is a horrifying phenomenon that is documented. They infiltrated those militias, and they assisted in directly killing interior Tutsis during the genocide. And when I discovered this, it was like discovering the whole foundation of the narrative as a lie, and discovering something was so rotten and so horrifying, because I had still seen the RPF through this prism of the RPF being something that, an organization that wanted to protect Tutsis at all costs and elevate Tutsis to, a status. But that is not true. They completely sacrificed the interior Tutsis, and in many cases had contempt for them and mistrust for them, because they saw those Tutsis who had stayed in Rwanda as being, as betraying the people who had been forced into exile.
Mm. And no, I know what you mean. When I remember when I was first sort of learning about this and reading, I mean, it was like such a shock, particularly the infiltration of Hutu militias, because I mean, this again, for people that are maybe a little unfamiliar, I mean, the story that gets repeated over and over again is, of course, of that again, in very sort of, racist sort of terms, that the Hutu are these sort of brutal, backwoods sort of group of people that are easily excited, and they love to murder people, and all these stories about radio transmissions that were inciting violence, and certainly that did happen, and we can get into why certain Western governments didn't try to jam radio transmissions that they knew were going on, inciting violence. But the infiltration into these Hutu groups is shocking, because it really just sort of, again, shows that the RPF, and I think it's, in a lot of ways, this is just the reality of global conflicts. I mean, there are almost never the sort of white knights that are there to protect people. But the way, again, I mean, the RPF has done such a good job of covering up this infiltration. Just keeping in mind that the story that we're telling you right now are RPF commandos going undercover into Hutu militias. And as you document in the book, Judi, I mean, literally just getting people so riled up that they'll go into a village and kill 100 people, Tutsis. And then, of course, the RPF will, sometimes they would come in and then kill those Hutus. And, again, it's all tit for tat. But this really just kind of just sort of blows the lid off of the entire kind of structure and the narrative that we were being fed. And again, they also despised many of the Tutsis that had stayed. Judi, I guess a little bit more on the... there's a wonderful chapter in the book, chapter 8 is the Tutsi fifth column. And, you're right, because there was, again, a bit of propaganda, maybe a bit of hype that, that many Hutus were attacking Tutsis because there was this, there were these rumors going around that there were Tutsi spies everywhere. And as you kind of document, to some extent that was true. And talk a little bit about this sort of these rumors that were kind of true, and then let's bring it up to nowadays, because Rwanda has almost turned into a complete nation of spies and informants. And I mean, almost, if not as extensive or more extensive than like a place like East Germany, where, I mean, nobody in Rwanda talks openly. You write in the book, everyone sort of speaks in code. And talk a little bit about that and how that sort of affected the population and the psyche of the people of Rwanda.
The current Rwanda, or how they first used Tutsis before and during the genocide? You want to kind of...
Well, I guess let's talk about current Rwanda right now,
okay.
Just because it's it is the legacy, obviously, of what happened. But how have these informants and spies and this sort of network, how has that kind of affected Rwanda today? Because there's a chilling part in your book where you talk about people are sort of forced into this as well. They're taken and they're trained and then they're inserted back into society. Talk a little bit about that.
In fact, there are people working for DMI and people working in civilian intelligence in every professional sector and public sector of Rwanda. And we have these representatives, these we call them cadres, who are at the smallest level, administrative level of society. So we have something called the Nyambakumi system, which allows what we used to call the abakata. These are civilian cadres working for the state, promoting RPF ideology, military and political ideology. We used to call them abakata. They're now called intore, and they work very effectively in conjunction with DMI at the Nyambakumi level, which is every 10 households on a hill. So if you can imagine all the way in which the surveillance state in Rwanda operates, and how people censor themselves and fear the state and live in silence or narc on their neighbors, as bad as that sounds. This is, or when they talk, they have to speak in code. You mentioned that earlier. It is. I mean, you mentioned the Stasi state. It is equivalent. There are so many parallels between Rwanda today and the Stasi state. Someone I was in touch with yesterday who was in Rwanda even last week said to me that even the diplomatic missions, even the embassies, the Western embassies, when you speak to these people, these officials, they'll tell you that they're living in the North Korea of Africa. I mean, that's what it's like. And so there's this Orwellian aspect or dystopian aspect to Rwanda that is real. Yet on the surface, you know, certainly the capital, it strikes you as like a city in Switzerland. It's really quite astonishing. But this is the way in which intelligence operates to shut down society, to clamp down on any freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And it's how the levers of propaganda have actually been very successful in. And, you know, of course, someone said to me as well that, you know, it's only a matter of days or maybe weeks where the Intore, the civilian catters, force the survivors, the Tutsi survivors, to stage protests against your book, public protests. There's a lot of staged events in Rwanda, and there are no protests, or there's no criticism leveled against the state. And if there is, there's a woman, a Tutsi survivor whose father was killed in 2015. Her name is Diane Rwigara, and she tried to run against Kagame in 2017 in presidential polls, and she has spoken about the repressive nature of Rwanda, and she's criticized the president, and she's now in jail. So you really, she has been very, very direct. It is prison or death if you speak your mind in Rwanda.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's it's such a shocking reality, and it's funny you're talking about that. You know, if you're in Kigali, it's sort of like Switzerland. And I knew a friend of mine. Her mother had traveled to Rwanda. She used to work in human rights, and you know, she said the same thing. I mean, it's everywhere. It's clean. Everyone is polite. It's very nice. But you know, behind that facade is, you know, everyone is sort of tense. No one's ever really fully relaxing. And again, when, as you say, I mean, everywhere from, you know, the cab driver to the bartender to your school teacher to, I mean, you know, your mayor are all gathering information, or, you know, they could inform on you. I mean, it creates this, like you said, I mean, it is like a true Orwellian society. And I think, as we'll talk about a little bit later, I mean, Rwanda is very good at monitoring online traffic, Skype, email. You know, their electronic surveillance is quite sophisticated. And again, for this tiny little country in the middle of Central Africa. But Judi, we're coming up right now on the break, so we're gonna take a few minutes. And we will be back, but we are speaking with journalist Judi Rever, who is the author of In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Lots more to discuss in the second hour, so please stay tuned.
to the world's meeting place. American.
It's practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes, I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Since the beginning, civilizations have risen and fallen. Rome, ancient Persia, Mongolia, Britain, and now America. Befallen by natural disasters, broken families, moral decay, lack of preparedness and conflict. Don't let this happen to you. Are you prepared? Would you like to help others prepare? AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com is looking for distributors. Email bugoutamerica@usa.com. Go to AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, a veteran-owned and operated company. But do it today.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me. American Freedom Radio, Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology, they have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
And when we're not invading some sovereign nation or setting it on fire from the air, which is more fun for our Nintendo pilots, then we're usually declaring war on something here at home. Did you ever notice that about us? We love to declare war on things here in America. Anything we don't like about ourselves, we declare war on it. We don't do anything about it. We just declare war on it. It's the only metaphor we have in our public discourse for solving problems, declaring war. We have to declare war on everything. We have a war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on litter, the war on cancer, the war on drugs. But you ever notice we got no war on homelessness? Huh? No war on homelessness. You know why? There's no money in that problem. No money to be made off of the homeless. If you could find a solution to homelessness where the corporate swine and the politicians could steal a couple of $1 million each, you'd see the streets of America begin to clear up pretty quick. I'll guarantee you that. I will guarantee you that.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good. Control is good. 5, rocket copy. 4, 3, 2, 1. Engage.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio. offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. I am your host, Pierce Redmond. If you are just joining us right now in the second hour, we are talking with journalist Judi Rever, who is the author of In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which is available on Amazon.com. Of course, we will link up to this in the show notes, as well as some articles of Judi's as well. But Judi, in the first hour there, as we were sort of closing out, we were talking about, the sort of network of informants, the sort of Orwellian state that has been created under Paul Kagame. But I think it's also important to give the audience a bit of a perspective and a flavor for the crimes of the RPF. I mean, what was really going on before, during, and after the genocide. And in particular, I mean, there's a couple of events and stuff that you talk about in the book that, sort of, again, blow the lid off of the myth of the RPF as a sort of benevolent force. A big one is the Byumba Stadium massacre, which is, in a lot of ways, is kind of like a template for RPF crimes. And maybe you can just kind of give us an idea about what happened here and how this sort of acts as I said, as a template. I mean, what happened at this stadium was obviously on a very large scale, but that is something that was used time and time again by the RPF throughout the genocide and even afterwards. So explain a little bit about what happened at this, I believe it was a soccer stadium, during the genocide.
Yeah, this was within a couple of weeks after Habyarimana, the Hutu president, was assassinated after the attack on his plane on April 6th. What had happened is there was a camp, one of many sprawling camps, Nyachonga, north of Kigali, that was attacked by the RPF. And remember, during the invasion war, Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Army controlled a vast swath of northern Rwanda. And there was a demilitarized zone in there where, in theory, no army, Hutu army or Tutsi army was supposed to be present. Of course, the RPF was launching attacks and had a presence in that zone, an unofficial presence. But we're now in April, and there's a genocide going on, and the RPF has complete control of the north very quickly, and is pounding at rounding up Hutus and killing them in a number of areas. But they had already attacked Nyachonga, a huge camp of Hutu displaced civilians, and they had cordoned off a lot of that area and were pushing. If you can see, they'd surrounded a lot of these refugees and were pushing them northward instead of southward. So some of those displaced Hutus got away and fled south, but basically the RPF pushed a number of them up to the Byumba Stadium, which was in Byumba town. And so what they did was they kept several thousand of these people at a main town hall grounds for a few days, and they were starving and in a pretty desperate state. And how I have some of the details is I've spoken to former RPF soldiers and officers about this episode. And so we're reaching April 20th, April 21st, 22nd. They say to the RPF, always good at propaganda, good at luring the enemy, promising them food, medicine, supplies, pots, pans, oil, everything they need. And they promised them that they'd eventually take care of them for a few days and then bring them back to their communities when things settle down. And to be honest, these people were unarmed, in desperate state, starving, had children, and didn't have any opportunity or ability to fight against an armed force that had them surrounded. And so they shuffled into the Buyumba Stadium, a huge stadium, and were told that they would be fed once they got in. And so they did this. This was around the 22nd of April. And once they got in and started to settle down for the night, feed their children, we're talking several thousand people in this area, in this stadium. Then the RPF got ready. They had basically their force called the military police in the stadium, and other people who were working for a particular division of the Rwandan Patriotic Army called High Command. There were DMI agents and officers in the stadium, and there were some people from another division of the army called the Training Wing. And so the Kagame's people got ready, and they started to separate the large and strong men, what appeared to be large, strong men, from the refugee, the greater group of people who were on the ground feeding their children. And they brought a lot of men to the dugout of the stadium, and they proceeded to kill them, shoot them, and kill some of the others with their signature weapon, which was a hoe, which was called agafuni. And then they started to immediately unleash gunfire, machine gun, and grenades on these Hutus, who were in a terribly weakened state to begin with. And so over the course of several hours, according to witnesses, ex-RPA soldiers outside the stadium and then inside during those operations, they proceeded to kill thousands of unarmed civilians. Now, that was in April, and it was pretty shocking. And Kagame, according to some sources I have, was in the town when that was happening. He wasn't in the stadium, but his military convoy and escorts were in the town, and he was staying in a house not that far from the stadium. And the next morning, the killing went on all night, and also the cleaning up afterwards was extensive. And he came by reportedly in the morning and found a few survivors that were injured and dying or couldn't move outside the stadium. And he was not happy that this had not been as clean as he had wanted it to be. And he ordered his military escorts from high command to clean up the mess. So this is just to give you an idea of his role in things. And there were senior members of the DMI in the stadium that night and Training Wing during the massacre. It was all very prepared and planned, and it was part of a number of large-scale massacres, Pierce, that would not only exterminate Hutu civilians, but free up land for Tutsi returnees. And that was part of the political strategy of killing Hutus during the genocide.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you talk about this a bunch in the book. I mean, Rwanda is not a rich country in many respects. So, farmable land, cows, things, you say, animals were always spared. Because, they were extremely important economically, for these returning, Tutsis from, Uganda, Congo, Burundi, Tanzania. Again, too, just so that, everyone out there is aware, I mean, this is the Byumba Stadium massacre, I mean, is actually fairly well documented, even by, groups like the UN, which are not, top of my list, in terms of, wonderful organizations. And certainly they have a lot to answer for when it comes to what was going on in Rwanda and later in Congo. But this is even documented by them to some extent. And again, these high-ranking RPF commanders, this is in the ICTR, I believe, even makes note of their presence at the stadium. And again, too, the brutality of Kagame to come and say, clean this up. And, as you said, too, the clearing land, I mean, this is somewhat similar, in like a Kagera Park. I mean, again, getting these people all together. I think in, there, they would say, oh, we're having a meeting with the village, we're going to talk to them and then they would basically massacre everyone. But this tactic that the RPF had of gathering people in a central space, supposedly offering them food and medicine and shelter, was used time and time again on a small scale and on a large scale. And many times too, then it was, they would burn the bodies, which is why, which is part of, why it's a little bit more difficult to prove some of the RPF's crimes, of course, because Kagame, again, a very intelligent, if brutal man, understood that satellite photos will be able to pick up grave sites. So it became,
Absolutely.
The order became to burn all the bodies, essentially covering up much of the evidence of all of this. Judi, we've mentioned it a couple times, and I know listeners are going to bug me if we don't touch on it a little bit, but the assassination of Habyarimana, this is again, it's becoming more and more kind of acceptable to talk about the truth about this, but this is also, again, one of the great myths of the genocide. The story, if you listen to, what's his, Philip Gurovich and other sort of pro-RPF journalists, if you can call them that, they will again repeat this myth that it was Hutu extremists within Habyarimana's own administration that decided to shoot down his plane, and he was flying with the president of Burundi as well, and that this is what sort of sparked the genocide. And this is, again, a complete myth, and again is also fairly well documented that it was in fact the RPF. So just touch on that a little bit, Judi, because I think it's important for the listeners to kind of understand that chapter in the history.
Well, there's very little compelling and supporting evidence to suggest that Hutu extremists or Hutu elements or the former Hutu army shot down the Hutu president's plane, killing their president, and killing the chief of staff, defense chief of staff of Habyarimana. I mean, not only does it not make sense, but there's very little evidence for that. The overwhelming and compelling evidence that independent bodies looking at this have collected shows that the RPA, that Kagame procured several missiles from Uganda, and those missiles that Uganda had in stock were bought were collected or bought from the former Soviet Union in the 1980s. And so investigators have already traced missiles that came from the Soviet Union and that were in Uganda. And the same stock of missiles, consignment, were some of those missiles were found, the tubes were found in Rwanda after Habyarimana was assassinated, and another missile more recently was found in Congo, in the former Zaire. So we have the trace of the missiles. And again, the most compelling evidence shows from the French investigation and from confidential investigation probe from the ICTR, from the UN tribunal, shows that Kagame trained and got together a missile team. And they had access to missiles. They assembled their missile teams. They held a series of 3 meetings to discuss how to assassinate the Hutu president. And so where does this evidence come from? If people are listening to me, the evidence comes from the first French judges probe, the release of his findings in 2006, and 3 years before from testimony to the tribunal from ex-RPF informants. That testimony of the assembling of a missile team, the choice of where they were going to release the missiles, the planning, the meetings to assassinate the president, and the actual bringing down of the plane on April 6th, that testimony evidence comes from 2 different sources. So that's why I say, and that's why people who have looked at these things say that this is the irrefutable evidence that Kagame it was behind triggering the genocide and assassinating the president, behind that act.
Oh, and as you just point out, I mean, it makes no sense really for them for Hutu extremists. Even if they were so extreme that they wanted to kill all the Tutsis, and again, the idea is that I guess Habyarimana had become not extreme enough for them. They had to know that by killing him, this would, of course, would create an opening for Paul Kagame to invade from the north. So yeah, I mean, it makes no sense. And again, there's a whole, an excellent chapter in your book just on the assassination of Habyarimana. And again, this is becoming more and more kind of, widely discussed. And again, there are just court documents, and Kagame can deny this all he wants and talk about how it's all propaganda. And I find it laughable, it's the French and, these imperialists, when, again, I mean, Kagame was propped up by, foreign governments throughout his entire career. And maybe we can kind of briefly touch on that a little bit, because there was, of course, again, this is something, I'm sure my listeners will berate me if I don't get into, but the Western collaboration with the RPF and with what was going on there, particularly the U.S. Obviously, they were looking the other way when it came to a lot of crimes. I mean, Bill Clinton famously didn't want to use the term genocide because this would sort of force his hand and he would have to get involved. But I mean, going a little bit deeper, Judi, I mean, there is a bit more to this relationship. I mean, famously, Kagame was in Fort Leavenworth at the start of the invasion, receiving training, which is a bit of a theme if you follow coups in Africa. Many times, coup leaders and stuff will happen to be in America training just before. That was the case in Mali with this colonel whose name is escaping me. But a few years ago, I mean, he was in the U.S. and then returned and then overthrew the government in Mali. And there are, of course, stories about CIA providing satellite footage. There's really no doubt that during the first Congo War that saw the overthrow of Mobutu, that there were U.S. Special Forces and CIA personnel working alongside the RPF and stuff. So talk a little bit about that, Judi, the sort of Western participation and collaboration with the RPF.
Well, just to briefly go back, I mean, you mentioned Fort Leavenworth. Yes, the United States was providing serious military and psychological operations training to a number of RPA commanders, including Kagame, at the moment of the invasion by the RPA into northern Rwanda in 1990. And when the RPF's leader, Fred Regima, was killed in the first few days of that invasion, and he was a kind of a different sort of man altogether than Kagame. When he was killed, Kagame hightailed it over from the States, and then became in charge. And so he became the military leader of the army, of the Rwandan Patriotic Army after Fred's death, and then proceeded to change tactics, and he started to pursue a scorched earth campaign in northern Rwanda. So there's that aspect. And of course, because Kagame had been in the Ugandan military and had benefited from the enormous financial, political, and military support that the United States gave to Uganda. So often people ask the question, what was the United States relationship to the RPF in those early years? Well, in fact, it was via Uganda. And even Herman Cohen, who was the United States Deputy Secretary of State for Africa during that time, he will be able to talk about the level of support that the United States gave Uganda, and perhaps if he is willing, he could talk about how that filtered down. But then when we move, certainly during the genocide, you mentioned Bill Clinton refusing to intervene, the United States administration actively working aggressively at the level of the Security Council of the United Nations to stay out of Rwanda, and not even jam Hutu radio broadcasts, but to stay out. And at the same time, we have Kagame telling the UN peacekeeping force to get out. We're going to shoot on you. We're going to attack you if you get in our way. We want you to withdraw. So the notion, the propaganda after the genocide that the world abandoned Rwanda is what I've just said, pure propaganda. It's hogwash, because Kagame did not want any international intervention. The U.S. obliged during that time. So also, and what I want to point out at this point, we know, and you probably know, that the U.S. in 1994 had effective use and was using every kind of satellite, from infrared to sensing, every kind of, they use keyhole satellites. They were using these in the war in the former Yugoslavia. So, for example, when the United States wants to nail a war criminal, an alleged war criminal, they want to bring this to an international court. If they want to expose what happened in Srebrenica, they'll pull out the satellite data, the satellite photographs. of war crimes,
Right.
who was there, who was stationed. So they will do this if they want it. They had the keyhole satellites. They're extremely detailed about what was going on in the areas controlled by Kagame in the north. They had all the satellites, infrared and what have you, which would indicate disturbance of Earth, and whether or not Kagame was burning, burying bodies, and the great disturbances in the Earth's terrain in Buyumba, in Kibungo, and in Akagera Park. I have attempted through the Freedom of Information Act to download or to get access to those changes in terrain, which would show what was happening in RPF zone. And your government's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency has told me that I can't get access to those, even though it's been beyond the 20 years where I should be able to. Why? Well, lo and behold, this is classified information. So there is a systematic attempt to cover up what was happening by the U.S. government, what was happening in RPF zones, what Kagame's troops did. And so if you then, just leaving that aside for a bit, we move from the genocide to the green lighting, the U.S. green lighting Kagame's invasion of Zaire, which then unleashed terrible horrors for years to come on the Congolese people. The U.S. Embassy, I have very good evidence that the U.S. Embassy in Kigali at the time, in 1996 and 97, or before that even, helped plan the invasion of Zaire, and also backed that invasion and helped provide satellite data to RPA troops as they invaded Congo and even as they killed refugees in their sweep from east to west. So that's how diabolical it is.
Mm. And if this isn't convincing anyone, as you're saying there with the invasion of Congo, then shortly thereafter, and you document this in the book, and we don't have to spend too much time on it, but although, because we could probably go on for hours and hours just about Congo, but you have the Kabila's Laurent Kabila's finance minister signing billion-dollar deals with American Mineral Fields, which is a huge mining operation, coincidentally headquartered in Bill Clinton's hometown of Hope, Arkansas, the CEO of which was invited to Clinton's inauguration. This is Jean Raymond Boulet, who also let various rebels from the AFDL fly on his Learjet. So again, there seems to be a bit of a pattern here. All of these American mining and Canadian mining interests as well, we should point out, suddenly descending on Eastern Congo. There's obviously a connection to all of this. And very briefly, because this really kind of jumped out at me, Judi, and you write about it just in the beginning of the book. And it really kind of shocked me, because this is, again, sort of almost like another one of these, myths undone. But you talk about Boulet, who's the CEO of American Mineral Fields. He flew a bunch of investment bankers, market analysts, Robin Sanders, who was the director of African Affairs for the National Security Council, and none other than Cynthia McKinney, to an area under rebel control in Congo. And then shortly thereafter, there's an AMF promotional video for investors featuring Cynthia McKinney. Now, I say this because Cynthia McKinney, who is someone that at one point I somewhat admired, but have become so disillusioned with her descent into I don't know what. She's always maintained this, facade of being for Africa, exposing all of these things. And what is going on with this video? Again, this is someone that made her career in many ways attacking Bill Clinton and for what was the rape and pillage of the African continent. And she's in a video for an American mining company? Can you explain this a little bit, Judi?
Well, I don't want to justify or explain too much on her behalf. You might want to interview her, but to be a bit fair, she later and fairly quickly, to her credit, realized what the U.S. had done and what the rebel group, AFDL and Kagame's troops were really all about. Now, why she let herself get manipulated in this way, or how she got caught up in going to Zaire before the president was toppled, getting into rebel-held zones with a group of investors, and the Robin Sanders, the Director of African Affairs for the National Security Council, and how she let herself become the face of the U.S. government to some extent on a promotional video put out by a mining company is beyond the pale, beyond me.
Yeah.
I'm not going to attempt to explain her actions, but I have to say, in the later months or in the later years, certainly she became a vociferous critic of U.S. policy in Central Africa. And I believe that she because she had been brought into that inner circle, then she realized, and she had knowledge of what they were doing. And, what I say in my book, and I constantly bring this back, I think, to the victims, I hope, is that these meetings and mining deals that were being struck were happening as Kagame's troops were massacring women, children, and men in the Congolese jungle. And so we have this. It is so haunting to me. It was haunting for many years that this was going on. The mining deals were being struck, and men with briefcases were showing up in rebel zones, and yet in the dense triple layer canopy, people were starving and being used, chased as prey and being killed, and so. Going back to how the U.S. backed this criminal regime and is complicit in war crimes, in my mind, is, they were providing satellite technology and satellite data to Kagame's troops as during the invasion and as they were proceeding across the Congo before it toppled. And so some of this technology was used to locate refugees and kill them, all in, and the U.S., willfully turned a blind eye or shoved in the closet all evidence of these killings, and anyone attempting to investigate or bring this to light was told, we're not going to deal with this. We're not going to talk about it. The particular aim at the time was to topple Mobutu, no matter what the human cost, and open up Zaire for business.
Mm. And, this is also marked at, when a boom in technology. Coltan is a mineral that's used in cell phones and computers and is, integral to the world that we live in right now. And, you talk about, the Rwandan army coming in, and they were pulling in something like $20 million a month through coltan, through basically a front company for the Rwandan army called Rwanda Metals. And you say at one point there were $250 million in 18 months. And that 70% of the coltan mined in Congo was under the direct control of the RPF, transported to Rwanda on Rwandan helicopters and stuff. And that's, of course, what powers our iPhones and things like that. It's like I said, the scramble for minerals in Congo, that's almost like another show that we could do, because there's so much to that. And again, that's like the legacy of the genocide, and we're talking about millions of Congolese being butchered and murdered because of that. But Judi, we've got about maybe a half an hour or so left, and there's still a few little things I wanted to kind of touch on with you. One of them is the sort of targeting of people that are speaking out about this, because this is, again, much of the legacy of the sort of government and the ideology of Kagame is to silence anyone that is speaking out against this. And it is, again, it is beginning to be sort of socially okay to talk about Rwandan intelligence agents kidnapping and killing people, not only around, in Africa, like in places like South Africa, where there's a couple of high-profile murders of former RPF officials. There was an intelligence chief that was strangled there, but also all over Europe, in Belgium, in France, and I believe in the Netherlands and other places. And Judi, you yourself have been the target of threats and harassment as well. And talk a little bit about that, because, the chapter where you write about it in your book is, it's sad, it's disturbing, but, you end that chapter by, talking about that if we don't speak out about this, then ultimately they win, because fear is just sort of that's how Kagame is able to operate the way he does. People are so afraid of him that no one will speak out, and therefore he can have agents going around kidnapping people and murdering them. So talk a little bit about the persecution of activists and people who have spoken out against RPF crimes.
Well, what I want people to take away from my book is, I'd like them to read it and seize upon some of the most, riveting details. But I think if you step back, and this is how I saw after years and years of research that, what I want to say is that, this is like just a synthesis, a brief kind of like look at a quarter century of atrocities in Rwanda and Congo that Paul Kagame and the regime have killed people to cover up. So if you look at the targeted killings from after the genocide, certainly in the late 90s and in earnest from 2000 on, we had the first wave, I have to say, of as soon as they could get out, some of the senior members of the RPF who said, I don't like this. This is really bad. I don't want to be a part of this criminal regime. From 2000 onward, we had all these people leaving, and he set out to kill them and succeeded in killing a lot of those Tutsis, his former Tutsi colleagues. And some of them were Hutus as well. There have been, senior people like Seth Sendashonga, who was a Hutu, who did not like the Habyarimana regime and felt that Rwanda needed to open up politically. And he joined the RPF struggle during the invasion war, but saw what the RPF did during the genocide and was appalled by 1995 and couldn't take it anymore. And he fled the country. And they tracked him down, attempted to assassinate him a few times, and succeeded in 1998 in the streets of Nairobi, Kenya. But getting back to this idea of there is certainly a concerted effort today, and there has been for 25 years, to kill people who might reveal these crimes. And they've also targeted foreign nationals, like the Spaniards during the counterinsurgency in the late 90s in Rwanda, who saw what the RPF was doing to the Hutu communities in Western Rwanda. They have gone after me as well.
And this is, again, kind of shocking, the level to which this goes on. And not that there's necessarily, complicity with this amongst the West, but there does seem to be sort of a, there are no real repercussions for the most part when this happens. Right? It's not as if Rwandan diplomats, aka spies, are not kicked out of countries in Western Europe when these things happen. I mean, I know there are some spies have been denied access, to certain embassies and things like that. But are there real repercussions when this actually happens?
No, there aren't. Okay, just to give you an example, Patrick Karegeya was former spy chief for Kagame, and he fled the country a number of years ago. He was, along with Kayumba Nyamwasa, who was a key member of the regime and headed military intelligence for a long time before he fled. Both of these individuals, Karegeya and Nyamwasa, ended up in South Africa. And Kagame attempted to assassinate them several times and succeeded with a group of agents in doing so on New Year's Eve in 2013. So the world woke up in 2014 and realized that Patrick Karegeya had been killed, strangled in a hotel room in Johannesburg, in a very fancy hotel. And immediately after that, you talk about repercussions. The South African government, which does not want crime by foreigners and high-level assassinations to take place on their soil, did expel the Rwandan diplomats from South Africa. However, they had the police and the hotel had cameras of the individuals going into the Michelangelo Hotel. They for all intents and purposes, said they were doing an investigation of this assassination. They wanted to get to the bottom of it. That was in 2014. We're now in 2018, and we have no concrete closure on how he was killed and who actually carried out that crime. And that is, realpolitik. South Africa has tried to maintain, despite it all, relations with Kagame's regime. And Kagame is now heading the African Union. So when Kagame goes after, targets individuals in Belgium or the UK, or when he's come after me in certain ways, does that mean that Western countries break off ties? Absolutely not. Does that mean they like this kind of espionage and violent activity, going on in their countries? No, but nothing ever comes of it. The dollars still keep rolling into Rwanda. There are no sanctions imposed. Kagame still is invited to events in the West. He's recently been here. He's invited regularly to the UN to speak and given the red carpet treatment. He's invited to Ivy League institutions in the United States. So I don't see at all any dent in his reputation. I think people see him now as a ruthless dictator, but because he has established a false moral authority for what people believe is stopping the genocide, which is not true. He didn't stop it. He also committed it during the genocide. He's allowed to do whatever he wants on the international stage.
That's a very interesting point there, Judi, that I agree with you. I think Kagame is, for the most part, now viewed internationally as a dictator. I mean, rightfully so. But he's like one of the pre-approved dictators. I mean, we spoke earlier. Yoweri Museveni, he's been president of Uganda for 32 years. I mean, there's no doubt that he's dictatorial. I mean, we praise Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. I mean, we have no real problem with authoritarian leaders. They just have to be our authoritarian leaders. and we can debate, there's all sorts of other leaders that we dislike, and what's really the difference. But yeah, I think Kagame, like you said, has been able to sort of attain enough respectability because of this myth that he stopped the genocide, that it's okay that he's extremely brutal and authoritarian in Rwanda. And again, we should point out too, I mean, like, the repression in Rwanda is still going on. I mean, it's illegal to talk about the genocide in any sort of terms that doesn't present the official narrative. There are these like re-education camps that Rwandan citizens are sent to to teach them, I guess, about the error of their way. And this is, like you said, is all sort of fine. I mean, he is invited to colleges and international functions. It's funny, like today Starbucks has closed all of their locations around the U.S. because of this incredibly racist incident that happened. But Starbucks still makes a big point about Rwandan coffee. As if that somehow, again, that's the soft power of Kagame, selling coffee and things like that.
Yeah, I've seen, I understand Robert De Niro's wife is very close to Jeanette Kagame and supports the regime. We have, Bill Gates does, Bill Clinton. We've had Bono. We've had all these people who are very big, supporters. Buffett's son is a huge backer of Kagame. I read this week, and I've seen this for a while. Meghan Markle talks about the miracle that is post-genocide Rwanda. In addition to talking about how she's going to wear her hair for the royal wedding, and who her matron of honor is, a Montreal girl. We have her praising the Kagame regime for its development. And, I understand in the news today that Prince Harry has just been in Rwanda or has met Kagame. There's something to this. And so we actually, in mainstream media, Rwanda gets a lot of good coverage. I don't think we understand what a criminal regime this is, and how it has a network of operatives worldwide that work through its embassies, what this government has done to Congolese citizens and what it's done to Rwandans. It's really extraordinary, and it keeps me up at night.
Oh no! You were saying before. I mean, it really is such a shock when you begin to kind of understand this. And we're fast running out of time. But you were just meant, again, they get a lot of good PR. You're saying Kagame is heading the African Union right now. A lot of Rwandan RPF war criminals, were placed in key positions within the UN peacekeeping forces. Again, because they allegedly have all this, expertise and stuff in stopping genocide. But Judi, we've got just a few minutes left, maybe 5 or 6 minutes. And again, I want you to tell everybody where they can go to check out the book, where they can go to read your work, and also just anything you want to leave the listeners with.
Well, I think the best bet for American listeners is to go online and look at Amazon.ca or possibly Amazon.com. As I mentioned, you can search In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and you'll be able to order online either the hardcover or, more interestingly, the digital version, which will be cheaper. I have to say it's been a big disappointment so far that an American publisher didn't pick up and decide to publish my manuscript. Otherwise, my book would be, if it would be in bookstores in the United States, and there'd be a lot of promotion. I think there's been a big resistance in mainstream media and publishing industry to hearing, in the United States anyhow, to hearing a narrative that counters the RPF narrative, which has been backed by Clinton and people who like to see themselves in Democratic circles, Democratic Party, circles, as highly evolved and highly, really progressive.
Yeah.
It does. It's not how people who are progressive see themselves, and so I think there's an incredible resistance in progressive media to hearing this story. But in the meantime, we're working in Europe to get the book available there, and it's certainly available here, and you can order it online. And I would just, as more of a final word, I know that you talk about these issues on your radio program, but the events that occurred in Rwanda, from Uganda into Rwanda during the genocide and then into Congo, have had, I want to say, they've had a devastating impact on so many people in the heart of Africa. You mentioned the millions of people who died in successive wars and conflicts in Congo since 1996, and that was when Kagame first invaded. And one of the key issues for me is that Kagame has never been reined in. Our international courts, the UN, covered up so much of the evidence from 2002, from the establishment of the ICC, the International Criminal Tribunal, court rather, in The Hague. They've had enough evidence to try him for backing militias that have ravaged the Congo, plundered, raped, and killed so many Congolese, but they have not done that. And so I think these are issues that we need to speak out about, because if we care about the world we live in, and we live, in some ways a borderless world, all these people matter. I think we need to start pushing our politicians to change things and look at these things and keep people accountable, because otherwise what these people live in now is a feedback loop from not dealing with these crimes that occurred 20 and 25 years ago.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with you there, Judi. And I think things like your book is a wonderful sort of step towards opening up this discussion, because it really doesn't have to, we don't have to wait until, Paul Kagame passes away and then we have these obligatory glowing obituaries in Western newspapers about how wonderful he was. I mean, we can, try our best to actually expose him and his criminal regime. I mean, it's not just him. There are many people still alive in places of power within Rwanda and internationally, in the UN, in human rights groups and stuff, that exert a ton of influence on how we view this very brutal dictator and who is just, a trail of blood behind him from Uganda to Congo, in Burundi. I mean, the list is endless. The influence that this one particular person and his organization have had. So, Judi, I thank you so much for joining us for this very long discussion. I hope to get you back on soon. And then very quickly, you are still writing for the Globe and Mail? Is that the best way people can go to check out some of your more recent work?
Yeah, you can Google me and look at some of the articles that I've worked on with Jeffrey York at the Globe and Mail. He's the Globe and Mail's correspondent for Africa. He's a tremendous journalist. I would urge you as well to look at something I wrote recently that was published, opencanada.org, that urges people to listen to people who have fled Rwanda over the last 20, 25 years. And really that essay that I wrote recently takes a look at how we've buried the evidence of crimes by Kagame's regime and how we've had a very tragic role in the history of suffering in Central Africa, and so I urge you to read that. There are a number of things, but hopefully your listeners will go out and buy my book. That would be the most exciting.
Absolutely. We will link up to all of that in the show notes, and I encourage everyone to get a copy of In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Judi, thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, I will be talking to you all very soon.
Thank you very much for your interest. It was good speaking to you.
No rules, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, We are American Freedom Radio.
Since the beginning, civilizations have risen and fallen. Rome, ancient Persia, Mongolia, Britain, and now America. Befallen by natural disasters, broken families, moral decay, lack of preparedness and conflict. Don't let this happen to you. Are you prepared? Would you like to help others prepare? AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com is looking for distributors. Email bugoutamerica@usa.com. Go to AmericanSurvivalWholesale.com, a veteran-owned and operated company. But do it today.
And I hope people support American Freedom Radio. And I hope people vote with their dollars and really understand the value of having American Freedom Radio. Because that's my family. If you love me at all, Jack Blood, support American Freedom Radio. Like, my family has literally disowned me. American Freedom Radio. Danny and Don and those guys, those are my actual family. So please support these guys, because they have all the technology, they have all these great things that they're going to do, but obviously they can't do it all by themselves. So not only would I like to see you support them, I'd like to see you retweet them and repost them and really get involved and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, on doing that do-it-yourself promotion, because they're a do-it-yourself radio network, and we just need that so much.
And when we're not invading some sovereign nation or setting it on fire from the air, which is more fun for our Nintendo pilots, then we're usually declaring war on something here at home. Did you ever notice that about us? We love to declare war on things here in America. Anything we don't like about ourselves, we declare war on it. We don't do anything about it. We just declare war on it. It's the only metaphor we have in our public discourse for solving problems, declaring war. We have to declare war on everything. We have a war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on litter, the war on cancer, the war on drugs. But you ever notice we got no war on homelessness? Huh? No war on homelessness. You know why? There's no money in that problem. No money to be made off of the homeless. If you could find a solution to homelessness where the corporate swine and the politicians could steal a couple of $1 million each, you'd see the streets of America begin to clear up pretty quick. I'll guarantee you that. I will guarantee you that.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio in service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
Launch sequence initiated.
launch phase, everything looking good. Control is good. 5, rocket copy. 4, 3, 2, 1, engage.
Prepare your mind to experience American Freedom Radio.